please smash that like button, subscribe to our channel, and let me know exactly what you would do with $4 billion in the comments below. Let's get directly into the Ice Heiress. The Ice Heiress. The rejection that cost $4 billion. The highly freezing rain violently lashing completely against the wealthy streets entirely of Madrid absolutely did not fiercely care that Lucia was heavily holding an incredibly fragile baby of only exactly 3 short weeks. It absolutely did not care that she possessed absolutely zero warm coat, or that her soft hands were violently trembling entirely from pure, unadulterated exhaustion. It absolutely only aggressively cared entirely about violently soaking her completely to the freezing bone, exactly as the highly heavy, solid oak door entirely of the luxury mansion violently slammed completely shut directly behind her, ruthlessly expelling her completely from the absolute only massive life she intimately knew. Securely inside that highly warm, incredibly luxurious house, her highly arrogant husband, Alejandro, was smoothly pouring himself a highly expensive vintage whiskey, happily toasting and loudly laughing completely with his highly toxic mistress, highly arrogantly convinced that he had finally, successfully completely rid himself entirely of exactly what he highly toxically called a pathetic dead weight. He genuinely, arrogantly thought he had flawlessly won. He highly foolishly believed that Lucia was absolutely just a highly pathetic, defeated housewife, completely without a single pathetic cent, and absolutely nowhere, entirely, to safely go. Alejandro absolutely did not magically suspect that the freezing woman violently shivering entirely on his expensive porch was officially, legally, the absolute brand new, massive owner entirely of the towering skyscraper, exactly where he highly arrogantly worked. Alejandro Reynolds had literally just violently thrown a massive, global multi-billionaire directly into the freezing street. And exactly by the highly precise time he profoundly realized it, it would be way too incredibly, catastrophically late, entirely, to pathetically beg. Part 1. The Toxic Prison. The highly suffocating quietness entirely in the massive Reynolds home was absolutely never, ever synonymous completely with absolute peace. It was a highly heavy, incredibly toxic calm. Exactly like the highly dense, terrifying air, exactly right, completely before a highly violent thunderstorm. It was a highly gloomy Tuesday, exactly in late October, entirely, in massive Madrid, and the freezing wind was absolutely already violently howling completely against the highly frosted glass, entirely of the massive kitchen window. Lucia aggressively wiped the thick sweat completely from her pale forehead, completely with the absolute back, entirely, of her shaking hand, violently shivering exactly as the highly sharp toxic smell entirely of harsh bleach aggressively irritated her delicate nose. She had actively been, frantically, aggressively scrubbing the massive marble countertops entirely for exactly 20 agonizing minutes, desperately attempting to flawlessly remove a highly stubborn coffee stain that her highly toxic mother-in-law, Doña Elena, had highly, accidentally, carelessly left that exact same morning. It is absolutely already completely clean. The highly toxic voice violently whipped completely from the massive doorway exactly like a highly lethal leather whip. Doña Elena confidently stood perfectly there, heavily wrapped entirely in a highly expensive cashmere shawl that easily cost significantly more than Lucia's absolute entire wardrobe completely before getting married. Elena absolutely did not actively look directly into Lucia's beautiful eyes. She intensely stared directly at the polished countertop completely, with her upper lip highly toxically curled, entirely into a highly permanent sneer, entirely of absolute disgust. "Yes, Elena," Lucia replied softly, her beautiful voice incredibly hoarse. She had absolutely not peacefully slept entirely in exactly 2 agonizing days. Her beautiful newborn son, Matteo, was actively going completely through a highly exhausting sleep regression phase, violently screaming completely throughout the entire agonizing night, entirely due, completely, to severe colic. And Alejandro had violently banished them completely to the small guest room, entirely because he highly arrogantly, desperately needed to absolutely be completely rested entirely for the massive corporate merger completely at the elite office. "It absolutely still visually looks incredibly dull," Elena highly toxically criticized, confidently approaching and aggressively running a flawlessly manicured finger completely over the polished stone. She meticulously inspected her expensive finger, successfully found absolutely nothing, but highly toxically wiped it completely on a highly expensive napkin. Absolutely anyway, completely with a highly exaggerated gesture entirely of absolute pure disgust. "My highly successful son brutally works exactly 17 agonizing hours every single day, entirely to actively pay completely for this highly massive luxury, Lucia. The absolute minimum you can highly possibly actively do is flawlessly maintain it. It absolutely isn't exactly as if you are actively contributing absolutely anything completely else entirely to this highly pathetic marriage." Lucia violently bit her soft tongue incredibly hard, the highly sharp, metallic taste entirely of bright blood rapidly filling her dry mouth. "Do absolutely not violently cry," she fiercely ordered completely to herself. "Do absolutely not generously give her that highly toxic satisfaction. I am actively doing the absolute best I highly possibly can, Elena. Little Matteo was actively awake the absolute entire night and, oh, completely stop highly toxically using the pathetic child exactly as a highly pathetic excuse," Elena violently snapped. "Highly capable women have absolutely been flawlessly raising innocent children entirely for agonizing thousands of years completely without actively letting their highly expensive houses violently turn completely into a highly disgusting pigsty. Intensely look directly at yourself. You are absolutely still actively wearing those highly pathetic sweatpants. Alejandro will confidently arrive entirely in exactly 1 short hour. Do you genuinely, arrogantly want him to vividly see you exactly like a highly pathetic beggar completely from the Puerta del Sol?" Lucia slowly looked completely down entirely at her highly cheap gray cotton sweatpants. They were the absolute only highly comfortable thing she could actively wear, completely following the highly painful C-section from exactly 3 short weeks ago. Her highly fresh incision absolutely still violently ached every single time the freezing weather abruptly changed and aggressively began to violently rain. "I will rapidly change," Lucia whispered incredibly softly. "Fiercely ensure that you absolutely do, and actively cook absolutely something that is highly safely edible exactly tonight. Absolutely not the highly toxic garbage you highly pathetically served completely on Sunday. Lucia's mother-in-law is incredibly toxic. How would you handle living with someone like her? Tell us below." The highly sharp sound entirely of the massive front door lock violently turning actively made Lucia's heavy stomach violently drop completely to the floor. Alejandro had arrived incredibly early. She frantically, rapidly smoothed her messy hair and aggressively rushed to nervously check the roasted chicken securely in the hot oven. It was flawlessly perfect. She carefully pulled it completely out just exactly, as Alejandro confidently walked directly into the massive kitchen. He was a highly tall, incredibly imposing man, flawlessly wearing a highly bespoke, dark navy blue tailored suit. But his handsome face was highly rigid, completely with highly evident, massive stress. He absolutely did not actively look entirely at her. He confidently went directly straight, entirely to the massive refrigerator, and aggressively grabbed a highly expensive bottle entirely of sparkling water. "Hello, my darling," Lucia stated incredibly softly. Exactly how was the highly busy day entirely at the massive office? Alejandro highly aggressively took a highly massive long drink completely before violently slamming the heavy bottle completely against the massive kitchen island, violently making a highly loud, sharp noise. An absolute, highly catastrophic disaster. The massive multi-billion-dollar deal completely with the highly powerful Vanguard Corporation is completely, violently stalled. The highly elite old Vanguard has tragically died, and the highly aggressive corporate lawyers are actively, violently blocking absolutely all massive assets completely until it is flawlessly verified exactly who the highly secret, absolute heir truly is. It is absolute, total chaos. "I am so incredibly sorry," Lucia stated incredibly softly, gently reaching her soft hand completely out, entirely, to lovingly touch his strong arm. He violently pulled completely away, highly abruptly, exactly as if her highly gentle touch violently burned his pale skin. "No, I am absolutely not entirely in the highly pathetic mood, entirely for your highly useless consolations." He intensely looked directly at her completely, from top, entirely to bottom, completely, with highly freezing, incredibly calculating eyes. "Is exactly that, exactly what you are actively going to highly pathetically wear entirely for massive dinner?" "I was actively cleaning. Elena explicitly told me that." "Elena is 100% absolutely right," Alejandro violently interrupted incredibly harshly. "A highly special, incredibly massive guest is actively coming entirely to massive dinner. Aggressively go directly upstairs, right this exact second, and actively put on absolutely something highly decent. And entirely for the absolute love of God, aggressively put highly thick concealer entirely on those massive dark circles. You visually look exactly like a highly pathetic, walking corpse." Lucia stood completely, utterly paralyzed perfectly in place. A highly massive guest? Alejandro, the entire massive house is a complete, chaotic mess. And little Mateo desperately has to actively eat entirely in exactly less than 20 short minutes. Alejandro violently slammed his massive palm completely against the hard countertop, actively making the expensive silver cutlery violently jump and loudly resonate completely in the highly tense kitchen silence. "I literally do not fiercely care a single bit entirely about the highly pathetic feeding schedule entirely of the screaming child, Lucia. The highly important woman actively coming is Valeria Thorne. She is the highly elite senior consultant entirely of the massive Vanguard merger. If I can successfully, flawlessly impress her, I will absolutely be the highly elite director entirely of the massive account. If I am officially the director, I will absolutely be a highly elite senior partner entirely of the massive firm. So you will aggressively go completely upstairs. You will flawlessly put on the highly expensive black dress I expensively bought you, and you will happily sit completely at this massive table and smile radiantly exactly as if you possess absolutely zero massive problems entirely in the massive world. Is that completely, explicitly clear?" Lucia nodded incredibly slowly, physically feeling exactly how the hot tears aggressively began to violently sting entirely in her beautiful eyes. "Yes, Alejandro, exactly as you fiercely wish." She frantically exited the massive kitchen, rapidly passing directly by Doña Elena, who was actively waiting completely in the long hallway, completely with a highly toxic, smug smile, perfectly on her thin lips. "Aggressively hurry completely up, pathetic Cinderella. The heavy clock is actively striking 12. As Lucia frantically climbed the highly steep stairs directly toward the beautiful nursery, completely with her massive heart violently beating incredibly hard. She possessed absolutely zero massive way entirely to profoundly know that this highly specific dinner was absolutely not entirely just a highly pathetic business meeting. It was the highly absolute beginning entirely of the massive end, entirely of her highly toxic marriage. But absolutely also the highly beautiful, massive birth entirely of her brand new, absolute life. Part 2. The Dinner of Humiliation. The highly loud doorbell entirely of the massive mansion violently rang entirely at exactly 7 p.m. sharp. Lucia had barely actively possessed highly sufficient time entirely to frantically shower and aggressively squeeze completely into that highly uncomfortable, expensive black cocktail dress. It violently squeezed her fragile waist, aggressively pressing highly painfully directly against her fragile body that was absolutely still actively recovering completely from the highly invasive surgery. But she had meticulously, flawlessly styled her beautiful hair and aggressively applied highly thick layers entirely of expensive makeup, entirely to flawlessly hide the massive, crushing exhaustion that aggressively threatened to violently collapse her. She had highly successfully managed to gently put little Mateo deeply to sleep, entirely in his expensive crib, frantically praying completely to absolutely all the saints that the tiny boy would peacefully rest entirely for at least exactly 2 solid hours. She walked highly slowly, completely down the massive stairs, exactly as Alejandro smoothly opened the heavy front door. In the grand threshold confidently appeared a highly striking woman who visually looked exactly as if she had literally just beautifully stepped completely off the highly glossy cover entirely of a highly elite haute couture magazine. Valeria Thorne was completely, utterly dazzling. She flawlessly wore a highly striking crimson designer jacket perfectly over a highly expensive silk blouse, highly impeccable tailored pants, and highly sharp stilettos that visually looked exactly like highly lethal weapons. Her bright blonde hair was a highly perfect, flawless curtain entirely of pure silk, and her highly toxic smile possessed absolutely something incredibly predatory. "Alejandro," she purred highly seductively, confidently entering the grand foyer and gently giving him a highly intimate kiss entirely on the cheek that intimately lasted exactly 1 massive second, significantly longer than absolutely necessary. The heavy traffic completely on the massive Castellana was completely impossible, but your massive house is incredibly charming, a tiny bit highly quaint, but incredibly charming. "Valeria, highly welcome," Alejandro warmly replied, and his deep voice violently dropped exactly 1 full octave, flawlessly transforming completely into the highly charming, perfect man that Lucia had absolutely once beautifully known. "Please confidently come directly in. Generously let me smoothly take your highly expensive coat." Lucia confidently took exactly 1 massive step completely forward, flawlessly forcing a highly fake smile that absolutely did not successfully reach her exhausted eyes. "Hello, I am officially Lucia, the loving wife entirely of Alejandro. Valeria smoothly turned her beautiful head completely toward her. Her piercing gaze aggressively swept completely over Lucia, completely from top, entirely to bottom, maliciously analyzing the highly cheap earrings, the highly slightly tight, uncomfortable dress, and the highly obvious postpartum swelling that was absolutely, still, highly visible. There was absolutely zero pure warmth entirely in her freezing eyes, only a highly toxic, mocking amusement. "Ah, absolutely, of course, the highly pathetic wife," Valeria stated incredibly dismissively, lazily extending a highly limp, cold hand. "Alejandro highly occasionally casually mentions you. I absolutely did not completely know you were so incredibly, highly homely." Alejandro let out a highly nervous, toxic laugh. "Lucia flawlessly takes absolute care entirely of the massive house. She is highly excellent completely with highly basic, pathetic domestic chores. The massive dinner should absolutely be completely ready. Right, Lucia?" "Yes," Lucia replied smoothly, rapidly withdrawing her soft hand incredibly quickly. "Absolutely everything is perfectly ready, entirely in the massive dining room." The highly expensive dinner was an absolute, highly agonizing exercise, entirely in highly systematic, toxic humiliation. Alejandro and Valeria sat intimately, entirely, on exactly one side, entirely of the massive table, highly enthusiastically discussing highly complex, high finance, massive stocks, and the highly chaotic, massive state entirely of the massive Vanguard Corporation inheritance. Lucia sat highly quietly, directly across, completely from them, entirely in absolute silence, highly listlessly moving the cheap peas completely from exactly one side, directly to the absolute other, entirely on her expensive plate. Absolutely, without actively tasting a single microscopic bite. Doña Elena highly proudly presided completely over the massive table, highly adoring absolutely every single, highly arrogant word that confidently came completely out entirely of Valeria's toxic mouth. "And explicitly tell me, Valeria, exactly where did you brilliantly study?" Elena asked completely with pure, absolute admiration. "Entirely at highly elite Harvard, actually," Valeria smiled highly arrogantly, taking a highly slow, elegant sip entirely of the highly expensive vintage wine that Alejandro had smoothly poured, a highly exclusive, elite bottle that he had highly toxically explicitly told Lucia was way too incredibly expensive to actually open entirely on their absolute first anniversary, exactly last month. Then I brilliantly did my highly elite MBA entirely at highly exclusive Wharton. Alejandro and I have actively been brutally working incredibly, highly closely entirely on the massive Vanguard file. He is incredibly, highly talented. Valeria's expensive stiletto highly smoothly brushed completely against Alejandro's strong leg, completely under the massive table. Lucia vividly saw exactly how the highly expensive tablecloth actively moved. She vividly saw Alejandro violently tense completely up, and then smoothly relax, exactly as a highly visible, dark flush rapidly rose completely up his thick neck. "So," Valeria aggressively continued, completely, utterly ignoring the absolute presence entirely of Lucia. "The highly massive rumor is that the highly secret heir entirely of Vanguard is completely, highly illegitimate. A highly secret bastard child that the elite old CEO actively had agonizing decades completely ago. Absolutely no one explicitly knows exactly who it truly is. But exactly whoever the hell it is actively about to miraculously inherit exactly 4 billion euros entirely in massive assets, massive real estate, and highly lucrative tech holdings. Can you even highly possibly imagine it? An absolute pathetic nobody suddenly completely with the absolute massive keys directly to the entire kingdom. It is an absolute massive waste, Alejandro toxically mocked, aggressively cutting his highly expensive steak completely with pure aggression. It is highly likely absolutely some highly pathetic, uneducated parasite who will violently blow absolutely all entirely of it, completely on highly ridiculous luxury cars and highly absurd luxuries. Highly pathetic people exactly like that absolutely do not profoundly know exactly how to successfully handle massive power. That is exactly why we desperately need to aggressively secure the massive seats entirely on the massive board, completely before the highly pathetic heir miraculously appears. We absolutely must aggressively control the highly complex transition. Exactly, Valeria stated, fiercely locking her piercing eyes completely onto Alejandro's. We desperately need to possess absolute complete control entirely in the massive boardroom, and completely everywhere highly else. Lucia physically felt blindingly nauseous. The heavy air entirely in the massive room was completely saturated, entirely with a highly evident, incredibly toxic sexual tension, completely between her highly arrogant husband and that highly toxic woman. She aggressively placed her heavy fork completely on the expensive plate, completely with a highly sharp, loud clatter. Alejandro, Lucia stated incredibly quietly. Can I actively speak completely with you entirely in the busy kitchen? Entirely for exactly one highly brief moment? Alejandro completely stopped actively chewing. The massive table violently fell, completely, terrifyingly silent. We are actively eating, Lucia. It is incredibly, highly rude to violently interrupt. Please, she aggressively insisted, her beautiful voice violently trembling. It is incredibly important. Alejandro sighed incredibly highly dramatically, aggressively rolling his piercing eyes directly toward Valeria. Generously excuse me entirely for exactly one highly brief moment. Highly pathetic domestic duties loudly call. Papa aggressively followed Lucia directly into the busy kitchen. And the absolute microsecond, the highly heavy swinging door completely closed. He violently lunged directly at her completely, with his handsome face violently disfigured entirely by pure, unadulterated rage. What the hell is completely wrong, completely with you? He violently hissed. You are actively, highly embarrassing me. You are actively, highly embarrassing yourself, Alejandro, Lucia violently whispered highly furiously. She is highly intimately touching you completely under the massive table. Do you honestly, arrogantly think I am completely blind? You are highly happily drinking our highly special anniversary wine completely with her. You are highly shamelessly actively flirting completely in my absolute face and entirely in the absolute face entirely of your toxic mother. Alejandro let out a highly cold, incredibly cruel, toxic laugh. Oh, aggressively grow the hell completely up, Lucia. Valeria is a highly vital, elite corporate connection. She can flawlessly create my entire, massive career, completely unlike you. I am officially your loving wife. And what an absolute massive prize, Alejandro violently snapped, aggressively approaching and highly threateningly looming completely over her to violently intimidate her. Intensely look directly at yourself. You are an absolute pathetic mess. You absolutely possess zero massive things completely in common, entirely with me anymore. You pathetically talk entirely about cheap diapers and pathetic baby spit-up. Valeria intelligently talks entirely about massive global markets and complex corporate mergers. She fiercely challenges me. You simply pathetically exist. Lucia physically felt exactly as if she had literally just been brutally, physically slapped completely across her beautiful face. I actively exist entirely because I am fiercely raising your biological son. And I actively pay entirely for absolutely everything, Alejandro violently yelled. I aggressively pay entirely for the massive roof completely over your highly pathetic head, the highly expensive food you aggressively put directly into your mouth, and the highly expensive clothes you actively wear. So if I desperately want to actively have a highly important business dinner, you violently shut your pathetic mouth and you highly submissively serve the expensive wine. Do absolutely not fiercely dare to violently ruin exactly this completely for me, Lucia. I am highly aggressively warning you. Before Lucia could successfully respond, a highly sharp, incredibly heart-wrenching, terrifying cry loudly echoed completely from the highly expensive baby monitor entirely on the hard countertop. Little Mateo had violently woken completely up. Great! Alejandro violently threw his massive arms completely into the heavy air. There aggressively goes the highly annoying siren. Aggressively go directly. Take complete care entirely of exactly that, and do absolutely not confidently come completely back down. I will flawlessly finish the massive dinner completely with Valeria and my highly supportive mother. You have absolutely already actively caused highly sufficient massive damage entirely for exactly one single night. Alejandro smoothly turned completely around and confidently returned directly to the massive dining room, flawlessly smoothing his expensive suit jacket completely with absolute, terrifying calm. Lucia was completely, utterly left entirely alone, completely under the highly bright, sterile light entirely of the massive kitchen, completely with hot tears violently rolling completely down her pale cheeks, entirely, while the highly terrified cries entirely of her innocent son violently grew significantly louder, completely upstairs. She absolutely did not completely know it entirely at that exact, highly specific moment. But there was a highly massive, highly critical reason exactly why the highly secret heir, entirely of Vanguard, had absolutely not been successfully found completely yet. The highly elite corporate lawyers were actively searching entirely for a highly specific woman, explicitly named Lucia Vance, but she had legally, completely changed her beautiful name entirely to Reynolds, exactly upon happily marrying. The highly massive, explosive connection was actively about to be completely, flawlessly made, and it would violently happen exactly tomorrow. Alejandro just treated his wife like absolute garbage. What is the worst thing a partner can say during an argument? Tell us below. Part 3. The €4 billion call. The highly bright morning sun violently struck the highly dirty plates entirely in the massive sink, completely with a highly raw, incredibly unforgiving light. The highly toxic dinner had officially ended incredibly, agonizingly late. Alejandro had aggressively stayed completely up, happily drinking expensive brandy completely with Valeria, completely until exactly 1 a.m., loudly laughing entirely at highly toxic private jokes, entirely while Lucia highly exhaustedly rocked a violently colicky Mateo, entirely in the highly quiet room, completely upstairs. When Lucia heavily came completely down at exactly 6:30 a.m., the massive house aggressively stank entirely of highly stale alcohol and highly expensive perfume. Valeria's highly toxic perfume. Alejandro was absolutely already entirely in the massive kitchen, highly aggressively drinking completely black, cheap coffee and rapidly checking his expensive phone. He visually looked highly hungover, completely with violently bloodshot eyes. I desperately need my highly expensive gray suit completely cleaned entirely for exactly tonight, he stated completely, without even bothering to actively look completely up. And absolutely do not actively prepare massive dinner. I will confidently arrive incredibly late. Lucia smoothly poured herself a highly simple glass entirely of cheap water, her soft hand violently trembling incredibly slightly. Alejandro, entirely about completely last night. I profoundly felt incredibly, highly uncomfortable completely with the highly toxic way Valeria aggressively spoke completely to me. And completely with exactly how you highly generously permitted it. Alejandro violently slammed his expensive phone completely against the hard countertop. For the absolute love of God, Lucia, are we genuinely, actively going to highly pathetically do exactly this right now? I am desperately attempting to aggressively secure a massive, elite future entirely for this massive family. Valeria is the absolute, highly critical key completely to the highly massive Vanguard deal. If I absolutely have to highly actively flirt just a tiny bit entirely to successfully get them to flawlessly sign the highly massive contract, that is exactly what the highly ruthless business world aggressively requires. You would profoundly know exactly that entirely if you had absolutely ever actively worked exactly one single day entirely in a highly real, massive job. I brutally worked entirely in the highly elite art gallery entirely for exactly 4 agonizing years, she softly defended. Highly pathetically selling cheap paintings directly to highly pathetic tourists is absolutely not a highly real business. Alejandro highly toxically mocked, exactly as he aggressively grabbed his expensive briefcase. I am actively leaving. Desperately try absolutely not to violently destroy the massive house entirely while I am actively gone. And keep the highly annoying child completely quiet. My highly supportive mother highly aggressively complained that his highly annoying screams violently woke her completely up exactly 3 agonizing times completely last night. With a highly violent slam entirely of the heavy front door, he confidently left. Lucia sank heavily completely onto a highly cheap kitchen stool, desperately hiding her pale face completely in her soft hands. She profoundly felt completely, utterly empty. She intensely looked directly at the highly massive mountain entirely of highly dirty plates, the highly expensive crystal glasses heavily stained completely with bright red lipstick, and profoundly felt a highly massive wave entirely of pure, unadulterated desperation so incredibly deep that she genuinely thought she would violently drown. Is exactly this my highly pathetic life? She deeply thought. A highly pathetic maid, a highly exhausted nanny, and a highly toxic punching bag. At exactly 10:15, the highly outdated landline phone violently rang. Lucia aggressively ignored it completely at absolute first, highly assuming it would be highly annoying advertising. But the highly sharp ringing was incredibly persistent, highly, incredibly urgent. Finally, she exhaustedly answered. Reynolds residence, please speak. Good highly morning. I am highly urgently attempting to successfully locate Ms. Lucia Reynolds, highly previously explicitly known exactly as Lucia Vance. A highly deep, incredibly authoritative voice confidently spoke completely on the absolute other side. My exact name is officially Arthur Sterling, senior elite partner entirely of Sterling, Wren and Associates completely in massive New York. Lucia frowned incredibly deeply. That is officially me. Is absolutely something highly wrong? Is it a highly expensive bill? Quite exactly the absolute contrary, Mrs. Reynolds. the highly powerful man stated completely, with a highly grave but incredibly respectful tone. I am officially the highly elite executor entirely of the massive estate, entirely of the highly late Victor Vanguard. Lucia stood completely, utterly frozen. The exact name, completely from the highly toxic dinner. The massive multi-billionaire, whose highly tragic death was aggressively causing so incredibly much massive stress, completely to Alejandro. I absolutely do not completely understand exactly why you are actively calling me Mr. Sterling. Did you profoundly know that your loving mother, Sarah Vance, brutally worked entirely in massive New York, completely in the highly late 80s? Yes! Lucia's massive heart aggressively began to violently hammer completely against her fragile ribs. She was a highly simple secretary. She tragically died exactly when I was exactly 10 young years old. She was officially the highly elite, absolute personal executive assistant completely to Victor Vanguard, entirely for exactly 3 agonizing years. Arthur Sterling smoothly corrected. And completely according entirely to highly massive, recently declassified, highly secure documents, completely from Mr. Vanguard's highly private safe. She was absolutely also his highly intimate, romantic partner. Mr. Vanguard profoundly knew entirely of your highly secret birth. He desperately wanted to officially, legally recognize you. But your loving mother frantically fled the massive city entirely to fiercely protect you completely from the highly toxic scrutiny entirely of his highly public, massive life. She desperately wanted you to successfully possess a highly normal, beautiful childhood. The massive room physically seemed to violently spin. Lucia frantically grabbed the hard edge entirely of the massive countertop. What exactly are you actively saying? I am explicitly saying, Mrs. Reynolds, that the highly advanced DNA test that we flawlessly cross-referenced completely with the highly official medical samples, entirely from the highly recent birth, entirely of your biological son, which are highly public record entirely in the massive hospital database, has officially returned highly positive. You are officially the absolute only biological daughter entirely of the massive billionaire Victor Vanguard. There was an absolute, highly eternal silence. Absolutely, only the highly soft hum entirely of the massive refrigerator could safely be heard. The highly extensive, massive search entirely for the highly secret heir is officially, permanently over, Arthur aggressively continued. You are officially the absolute, only massive beneficiary entirely of the highly massive Vanguard inheritance. This highly explicitly includes the highly absolute majority stake entirely of Vanguard Corp., the highly massive global real estate portfolio, and highly liquid, massive assets. The highly exact total valuation completely at the absolute close entirely of the massive market this highly specific morning is highly approximately exactly 4 billion euros. Lucia's weak legs completely, violently, gave completely out. She violently slid completely down the hard cabinet, directly to the freezing floor completely, with the expensive phone tightly pressed completely to her ear. 4 billion. This absolutely has to fiercely be a highly pathetic joke, she whispered incredibly softly. It is absolutely no massive joke. I officially possess a highly secure, a secure armored courier currently actively on his exact way, directly to your highly private residence. Right this exact second, completely with the highly certified legal documents, and a highly temporary, elite black debit card, completely with a highly massive access limit, entirely of exactly 5 million euros completely for your highly immediate massive needs. I urgently need you to highly officially sign completely for absolute receipt. Does absolutely anyone completely else profoundly know? Lucia asked, physically feeling a highly complex mixture entirely of blinding panic and massive adrenaline. Absolutely no one, Arthur firmly stated. We highly strictly maintain absolute total confidentiality. However, exactly once the highly official probate is officially filed, the absolute next massive week, it will officially be completely, highly public domain. For exactly right now, you legally, officially, hold the absolute, most incredibly powerful, massive cards entirely in the entire massive city, completely in your soft hand, Mrs. Reynolds. Lucia violently hung completely up the expensive phone, completely in a massive state entirely of pure, unadulterated shock. She intensely looked completely around. The highly polished granite countertops she had brutally scrubbed completely until her soft hands violently bled. The highly polished floor she had aggressively swept. The massive house that legally belonged completely to Alejandro. Exactly where she was absolutely only a highly pathetic guest. She was absolutely no longer a highly pathetic guest. She could highly effortlessly actively buy that massive house. She could highly effortlessly actively buy the entire damn massive street. She could highly effortlessly actively buy Alejandro's massive company and violently fire him completely. But exactly as the blinding shock slowly, beautifully passed, a completely, utterly different, massive emotion completely flooded her, massive hope. She deeply thought entirely about Alejandro's highly stressed face. The massive stress, the highly toxic desperation entirely to successfully be a senior partner. She naively thought that massive money was the highly toxic root entirely of absolutely all their highly explosive arguments. If I explicitly tell him, she naively thought completely with hot tears, beautifully shining entirely in her eyes. He absolutely won't be highly stressed completely anymore. We can successfully be completely free. Doña Elena absolutely won't actively have to highly toxically live completely with us. We can beautifully move completely to a highly massive, beautiful house, exactly where I absolutely do not have to actively be the highly pathetic maid. This can miraculously save us. She confidently stood completely up, aggressively wiping her exhausted eyes. She absolutely wasn't actively going to violently sink him. She was actively going to miraculously save him. She was actively going to flawlessly fix her shattered marriage. At exactly 11 a.m., the highly armored courier securely arrived. Lucia aggressively signed the highly official papers completely with a violently trembling hand. She fiercely held the highly thick, heavy envelope incredibly tight, completely against her fragile chest. It was completely, undeniably real. She fiercely decided to beautifully prepare a highly special, massive dinner. She would explicitly tell him exactly tonight. She would highly proudly place the highly official legal documents completely on his expensive plate. She possessed absolutely zero microscopic idea that entirely at that exact, highly specific moment, Alejandro was actively in a highly expensive hotel room, entirely downtown, completely with Valeria Thorne. And they absolutely were not actively discussing the highly massive merger. They were highly aggressively, toxically discussing exactly how to completely, violently get rid entirely of Lucia completely forever. Lucia is secretly a billionaire. What is the absolute first thing you would buy with 4 billion euros? Tell us below. Part 4. The ultimate betrayal. The highly massive, violent storm completely broke entirely over massive Madrid, exactly around 5 p.m. The freezing rain aggressively lashed completely against the large windows, flawlessly dyeing the massive sky a highly bruised, toxic purple. Lucia had aggressively spent the absolute entire, beautiful afternoon highly meticulously preparing. She had highly expensively ordered massive, highly premium Wagyu beef, actively using the absolute last pathetic money Alejandro had highly toxically given her entirely for cheap groceries. And she had beautifully prepared a highly delicious truffle risotto. She had successfully put little Matteo safely to sleep entirely for his afternoon nap. She had absolutely even beautifully lit highly romantic candles, completely all over the massive house. The highly thick, massive envelope entirely from Arthur Sterling eagerly waited perfectly on the beautiful fireplace mantel. She flawlessly wore her absolute favorite, highly beautiful soft blue silk dress that Alejandro arrogantly used to explicitly say, beautifully matched her piercing eyes. She profoundly felt incredibly nervous, highly euphoric, and completely, utterly terrified absolutely all at once. At exactly 6:30 p.m., the heavy front door smoothly opened. "Alejandro!" Lucia happily called, confidently walking completely out entirely into the long hallway. "The massive dinner is miraculously almost—" She completely stopped. Alejandro was absolutely not completely alone. Doña Elena was confidently with him, which was highly normal. But Valeria Thorne was absolutely also confidently there. And there was a highly suspicious fourth person, a highly unassuming man, completely in a highly cheap suit, who aggressively carried a heavy briefcase. Alejandro absolutely didn't even actively look entirely at her. He aggressively shook his wet umbrella completely against the hard floor, absolutely not fiercely caring a single bit entirely about the massive puddle violently forming completely over the highly expensive rug entirely in the grand foyer. "What exactly is actively happening?" Lucia asked, nervously twisting her soft hands incredibly tightly. "Alejandro, I beautifully prepared a highly special dinner. I possess highly massive news. Incredible, massive news." Alejandro slowly looked completely up. His handsome face was a highly freezing mask, entirely of solid stone. There was absolutely zero pure love entirely in it. Absolutely not even the highly toxic residual anger completely from the chaotic morning. Only a highly freezing, incredibly flat, absolute determination. "We are absolutely not actively having massive dinner, Lucia," Alejandro stated completely with a highly monotonous voice. "Sit completely down." "But exactly who are these highly strange people?" "He is officially Mr. Henderson." Alejandro vaguely gestured directly toward the highly unassuming man, completely with the heavy briefcase. "My highly elite divorce lawyer." Lucia's massive heart completely, violently, stopped. She intensely looked directly at Valeria, who was highly casually leaning completely against the heavy doorframe, completely, with a highly toxic, smug smile, entirely of absolute triumph, perfectly on her bright red lips. Valeria aggressively crossed her slender arms, intensely looking directly at Lucia, exactly as if she were a highly pathetic insect, entirely to be violently stepped completely on. "Lawyer," Lucia whispered, physically feeling a highly freezing chill violently run completely down her spine. "Sit completely down," Doña Elena violently barked, completely from the expensive sofa. "Completely stop actively making a highly pathetic scene, and intensely listen completely to my successful son." Lucia sat heavily completely on the absolute edge entirely of the expensive armchair. She profoundly felt incredibly small, highly diminutive. The highly thick envelope perfectly on the fireplace mantel physically seemed exactly millions, entirely of miles, completely away. Alejandro confidently approached the highly polished coffee table and aggressively dropped a highly thick pile entirely of official legal papers. They violently landed completely with a highly dull, heavy thud that loudly resonated completely in the highly silent room. "I have officially filed entirely for a highly rapid divorce, Lucia," Alejandro stated completely, with a highly terrifying, absolute calm. Lucia's entire massive world violently tilted completely on its axis. "What?" "I am officially requesting an absolute divorce," he aggressively repeated significantly slower, exactly as if he were highly toxically speaking completely to a highly stupid young child. "This highly pathetic marriage absolutely does not work. It absolutely hasn't successfully worked entirely in a highly long, agonizing time. You are incredibly unhappy. I am, highly certainly, incredibly unhappy. And quite frankly, you are an absolute pathetic dead weight. A dead weight." Lucia violently choked, pure incredulity highly coloring her beautiful voice. "Alejandro, I fiercely raise your biological son. I meticulously clean your massive house. I fiercely support you. You aggressively do the absolute bare minimum, Lucia," Alejandro violently yelled, his highly toxic composure finally, completely violently cracking. "Intensely look directly at yourself. You absolutely possess zero massive ambition. You absolutely possess zero elite motivation. You are absolutely just completely there. Valeria and I have absolutely been highly intimately talking. We profoundly realized that entirely for me to successfully reach my absolute maximum potential, I desperately need a highly elite partner who profoundly understands my massive world. Absolutely not a highly pathetic housewife who arrogantly thinks that fiercely scrubbing a cheap countertop is a highly successful day's grueling work." Valeria confidently took exactly one massive step completely forward, smoothly sliding her soft hand completely over Alejandro's broad shoulder. He absolutely did not violently pull completely away. He smoothly leaned completely into her, actively seeking her highly toxic support. "It is absolutely entirely for your absolute own good, Lucia," Valeria stated, her toxic voice heavily drenched completely in highly fake, toxic sympathy. "Alejandro desperately needs to actively be completely free, entirely to successfully ascend. You are violently holding him completely back. We are actively going to absolutely be a highly elite, massive power couple. You absolutely cannot highly possibly compete completely with exactly that." Lucia intensely looked directly at absolutely both, entirely of them. The massive, brutal betrayal was so incredibly physical, so incredibly palpable, that it physically felt exactly like a highly sharp knife violently plunged completely into her fragile gut. "You are actively leaving me completely for her. I am actively leaving you completely for a significantly better, massive future," Alejandro smoothly corrected incredibly coldly. He highly aggressively pointed directly at the heavy papers, perfectly on the massive table. "I explicitly asked Henderson to flawlessly draft a highly fair, generous agreement. I will highly generously give you a highly pathetic monthly allowance entirely for exactly 6 short months. Highly sufficient entirely to successfully get a highly small, cheap apartment entirely on the absolute outskirts. Perhaps you can highly pathetically go completely back to actively selling cheap paintings or exactly whatever highly useless thing you used to actively do." "And little Matteo?" Lucia asked, her beautiful voice violently trembling completely with absolute terror. "Matteo permanently stays perfectly here," Doña Elena violently interrupted incredibly sharply. He is officially a highly prestigious Reynolds. He legally belongs completely in this massive house. You will be highly generously permitted to actively visit him entirely on the highly busy weekends, completely under highly strict elite supervision. Absolutely, of course. We absolutely cannot highly generously permit you to violently drag him completely down directly into the highly pathetic type entirely of cheap life. You will absolutely eventually end completely up entirely in. No! Lucia violently stood completely up. A highly sudden, massive wave entirely of pure adrenaline violently flooding her weak veins. No! You are absolutely not actively going to violently take my innocent son. I absolutely possess the absolute best, highly elite lawyers entirely in the massive city, Lucia, Alejandro stated incredibly cruelly. I possess massive money. You possess absolutely nothing. Exactly who do you genuinely, arrogantly think the stern federal judge will highly generously give absolute custody completely to? The highly powerful vice president entirely of an elite investment fund, or the highly pathetic unemployed woman completely with zero massive assets? Lucia stared intensely directly at him. The highly toxic irony was so incredibly sharp that it miraculously almost actively made her violently laugh completely with pure hysteria. Zero massive assets. She rapidly looked completely at the fireplace mantel. The highly thick envelope was exactly right, perfectly there. Securely inside was the highly undeniable, absolute proof that she could highly effortlessly buy and sell Alejandro Reynolds exactly 100 agonizing times completely over. Alejandro, she stated, her beautiful voice miraculously recovering a highly strange, absolute firmness. You are actively committing a highly massive mistake, an incredibly enormous catastrophic mistake. I successfully possess absolutely something highly massive to explicitly tell you. Absolutely something that violently changes absolutely everything. I absolutely do not desperately want to clearly hear your highly pathetic pleas, Alejandro toxically mocked. I absolutely do not desperately want to clearly hear your highly empty promises that you will aggressively do significantly better. It is way too incredibly, catastrophically late. It absolutely isn't a highly pathetic plea, Lucia stated. She confidently took exactly one massive step directly toward the fireplace mantel. It is entirely about massive money. I successfully received a highly important letter completely today. I literally do not fiercely care a single bit entirely about your highly pathetic mail, Alejandro violently roared. He aggressively grabbed her soft arm, violently stopping her completely dead in her tracks. I desperately want you to violently leave right this exact second, Alejandro. Intensely listen to me, Lucia violently screamed. I officially herited. I explicitly said, get the hell out! Alejandro violently pushed her. It absolutely wasn't a highly massive hard push. But Lucia was actively wearing highly slippery socks, perfectly over the highly polished parquet floor. She violently slipped. She aggressively stumbled completely backward, her fragile hip violently striking the small side table. A highly expensive vase, Doña Elena's absolute favorite, highly priceless Ming vase, violently wobbled and aggressively crashed completely against the hard floor, violently shattering completely into 1,000 microscopic pieces. A highly deathly, heavy silence violently filled the entire room. Doña Elena let out a highly sharp, highly piercing shriek. My priceless vase! That explicitly cost exactly 30,000 euros. You highly useless, pathetic, clumsy cow! Alejandro intensely looked directly at the violently shattered porcelain, his handsome face violently turning bright purple completely with pure rage That is absolutely it. Get the hell out right this exact second. Alejandro, please. Aggressively pack your cheap things and get the hell out. Alejandro violently screamed. I absolutely do not fiercely want you entirely in my massive house entirely for a single microscopic second, significantly longer. Henderson, violently hand her the official eviction order. The highly unassuming lawyer aggressively stepped completely forward and violently shoved a highly official piece entirely of thick paper directly against Lucia's fragile chest. Mrs. Reynolds, you are officially, highly legally notified that you absolutely must legally vacate the massive premises, completely, immediately, entirely due, completely, to highly malicious destruction entirely of massive property and highly aggressive, hostile behavior. You absolutely cannot legally do this, Lucia violently sobbed. It is actively raining completely in buckets. I possess absolutely nowhere entirely to safely go. That is absolutely not my pathetic problem, Valeria stated, highly arrogantly checking her expensive Cartier watch, completely with highly toxic impatience. We officially possess a highly exclusive dinner reservation entirely at La Bernarda to beautifully celebrate the highly rapid divorce. You are actively making us incredibly late. Alejandro aggressively grabbed Lucia completely by her soft arm and violently dragged her directly toward the heavy front door. Wait, Matteo! Lucia screamed loudly, violently struggling completely against him. I absolutely will not violently leave completely without my innocent son. Violently take him completely then, Alejandro violently screamed. Aggressively take the highly pathetic crying brat. He has absolutely been violently screaming the absolute entire agonizing week absolutely anyway. Highly generously do me a massive favor and violently take him completely away entirely so I can finally successfully sleep a highly pathetic little bit. Alejandro violently dragged her completely to the absolute foot entirely of the steep staircase. Aggressively go rapidly pack a highly cheap bag. You officially possess exactly 5 short minutes. If you are absolutely not completely out, I will highly aggressively call the elite police and explicitly tell them that you violently attacked my highly supportive mother. Lucia frantically ran completely up the steep stairs at absolute top speed, violently sobbing, completely uncontrollably. She frantically rushed directly into the beautiful nursery. Little Matteo was completely awake, intensely looking directly at her, completely with massive, highly terrified eyes. She aggressively grabbed the heavy diaper bag, frantically shoved exactly as incredibly many cheap baby clothes, clean diapers, and heavy cans entirely of baby formula, exactly as she highly possibly could. She aggressively grabbed her absolute own, highly simple coat, frantically ran completely down the steep stairs, fiercely clutching her innocent baby completely against her fragile chest. Alejandro confidently stood perfectly next, completely to the heavy front door, highly aggressively holding it completely wide open. The freezing rain violently poured completely in, aggressively soaking the highly expensive rug entirely in the grand foyer. Aggressively give me the expensive keys, he fiercely demanded. Lucia frantically pulled the expensive car keys and the heavy house keys completely from her deep pocket and aggressively dropped them directly into his massive hand. Highly pathetic luck, Lucia, Alejandro stated, his deep voice completely, utterly devoid entirely of absolutely any human emotion. Desperately try, absolutely not to violently ruin the entire life, entirely of the absolute next pathetic guy. He violently pushed her completely out directly onto the freezing porch and aggressively slammed the highly heavy, solid oak door completely shut. The highly loud sound was exactly like a highly lethal gunshot entirely in the freezing night. Lucia stood perfectly frozen there, The freezing rain, instantly, violently soaking her highly expensive silk dress. The highly freezing, bitter wind aggressively biting her pale skin. She fiercely protected little Matteo completely with her fragile body, lovingly wrapping the incredibly tiny bundle completely with her warm coat. She was violently shivering. She was completely homeless. She was completely, utterly alone. She intensely looked directly at the highly closed, heavy door. She could clearly hear loud, pure laughter completely from the warm inside. They were highly enthusiastically celebrating. Lucia smoothly turned completely around and confidently walked completely down the steep steps, the freezing water loudly splashing completely in her highly expensive shoes. She confidently walked directly to the freezing sidewalk, intensely looking completely from exactly one side directly to the absolute other, entirely of the highly dark, rain-swept street. She gently reached completely into the deep pocket entirely of her warm coat. Her soft fingers highly smoothly brushed the highly freezing, hard plastic entirely of the highly elite, temporary black debit card that Arthur Sterling had miraculously sent her. She aggressively pulled completely out her expensive phone. It was completely wet, but absolutely still perfectly worked. She rapidly dialed the highly specific number that Arthur had explicitly given her. "Mr. Sterling," she stated, her beautiful voice violently broken. "Mrs. Reynolds, is absolutely everything perfectly fine?" "No," Lucia stated, intensely looking completely back directly at the massive house that had absolutely been her highly toxic prison. "I desperately need a highly armored luxury car, and I desperately need a highly exclusive luxury hotel. The absolute best, exactly one that you highly possibly have." "Completely understood," Arthur stated, his deep voice violently tightening. "I will absolutely possess the massive corporate limousine directly there, entirely in exactly 10 short minutes. And Reynolds, yes, we will highly aggressively make them violently pay." Lucia intensely looked directly at the highly illuminated living room window. She could vividly, clearly see Alejandro happily pouring expensive champagne completely for Valeria. "Yes," Lucia whispered incredibly softly, her piercing eyes violently hardening exactly as the hot tears beautifully washed completely away entirely with the freezing rain. "We absolutely will!" A highly massive, incredibly long black Rolls-Royce smoothly turned the dark corner, its highly blinding headlights violently cutting completely through the massive storm, exactly like the highly terrifying eyes, entirely, of a highly lethal predator. The multi-billionaire heiress had officially, confidently entered the massive, lethal game. Lucia is finally taking action. What do you think she's going to do to Alejandro's career? Drop your best theories below. Part 6. The Queen's Return. Exactly 4 agonizing weeks significantly later, the massive, absolute transformation was completely, utterly absolute. The highly powerful woman who confidently stepped completely out entirely of the massive black SUV perfectly in front, entirely of the highly imposing, massive monolith, entirely of freezing glass and hard steel, entirely of the Vanguard Tower, absolutely bore zero microscopic resemblance completely to the highly terrified, humiliated, pathetic wife entirely from the Reynolds' highly dirty kitchen. Lucia Vance flawlessly wore a highly bespoke, incredibly sharp Italian tailored suit, entirely in highly dark charcoal gray that beautifully accentuated her incredible figure. Exactly now significantly firmer and incredibly more highly confident. Her beautiful hair, highly previously an absolute, highly unkempt mess, entirely from pure exhaustion, was exactly now a highly sharp, flawless blonde bob that perfectly framed her beautiful face exactly like a highly intimidating helmet entirely of solid gold. Her highly expensive makeup was absolutely impeccable, flawlessly highlighting piercing eyes that had completely, permanently lost absolutely all their highly pathetic softness, entirely, to actively gain a highly terrifying, unbreakable determination entirely of solid steel. She flawlessly wore absolutely no highly flashy jewelry other than a highly simple but devastatingly expensive Cartier watch. She absolutely did not simply walk. She seamlessly glided completely with a highly lethal, absolute grace. And her highly sharp stilettos aggressively marked a highly terrifying rhythm entirely of massive power, completely on the highly polished marble entirely of the massive lobby. Arthur Sterling confidently walked perfectly by her side, visually looking exactly like a highly proud, elite general flawlessly escorting his absolute, untouchable queen. "Are you completely ready?" he murmured softly. "I have absolutely been completely ready, entirely from the exact, precise moment he violently pushed me completely out, entirely, into the freezing rain." Lucia responded completely, with a highly glacial, freezing coldness. They confidently entered the highly massive atrium, entirely of the massive Vanguard headquarters. It was an incredibly massive space, flawlessly designed entirely to violently intimidate, completely with highly towering 15-meter ceilings and highly massive waterfalls, aggressively cascading completely down highly dark volcanic stone walls. That highly specific day was officially hosting the highly crucial, massive meeting entirely for the highly complex merger completely between Apex Capital, Alejandro's massive company, and Vanguard. The massive lobby violently boiled completely with highly elite, top-level executives. Lucia highly sharply spotted Valeria Thorne, confidently standing perfectly near the highly secure security desk. Valeria visually looked incredibly impatient, highly arrogantly checking her expensive phone. As Lucia smoothly passed completely by, Valeria rapidly looked completely up, aggressively squinting her piercing eyes completely with highly massive confusion. She absolutely did not vividly recognize the highly powerful woman completely in the €5,000 bespoke suit, entirely at absolute first glance. Then, Alejandro frantically entered completely through the massive revolving doors. He visually looked incredibly frantic. His expensive silk tie was slightly, highly messily crooked, and there was a highly visible sheen entirely of thick sweat, completely on his pale forehead, completely, despite the highly freezing November cold. He had aggressively spent the absolute last agonizing month completely drowning entirely in highly massive debts, highly aggressively dodging the highly annoying phone calls completely from his highly toxic mother entirely about highly overdue bills, and desperately attempting to flawlessly keep Valeria completely happy, who was absolutely already aggressively beginning to get highly, incredibly bored entirely of his highly unstable financial instability. Today was his absolute, final, highly desperate card. If the massive deal flawlessly closed, he was miraculously saved. He was frantically running directly toward the highly secure elevators exactly when he miraculously, almost violently, collided completely with Lucia. "Intensely look exactly where you—" Alejandro aggressively began to violently snap, but he completely, violently, stopped entirely dead in his tracks. His arrogant jaw completely, utterly dropped. It was officially Lucia, but it absolutely wasn't. This highly terrifying woman aggressively radiated massive, blinding wealth and a highly terrifying, absolute confidence that violently made him cowardly step completely back. She visually looked absolutely incredible. Significantly, infinitely better than Valeria entirely on her absolute best, highly curated day. "Lucia!" he gasped violently. Massive, pure confusion, violently clouding his handsome face. "What? What exactly are you actively doing exactly here? Exactly how the hell did you successfully pass highly elite security?" Lucia completely stopped, and incredibly slowly, highly elegantly, turned completely around to fiercely face him. She intensely looked directly at him completely from top, entirely to bottom, completely, with the exact same, highly freezing look entirely of absolute, total contempt that he had highly toxically dedicated entirely to her, so incredibly many massive times. "Hello, Alejandro. You visually look incredibly terrible. You visually seem highly exhausted." Her beautiful voice was incredibly soft, highly calm, and completely, utterly indifferent. Alejandro violently bristled, desperately attempting entirely to aggressively force his highly fragile ego entirely to violently overcome his massive, blinding bewilderment. "I am incredibly busy, Lucia. I possess the absolute most highly important, massive meeting entirely of my entire career, completely up perfectly here. If you have highly pathetically come entirely to highly pathetically beg entirely for massive alimony, rapidly call my elite lawyer. You absolutely cannot highly inappropriately show completely up, entirely, at my elite workplace completely in that highly fake, pathetic disguise." He nervously pointed directly at her highly expensive suit, profoundly knowing completely deep down that the highly impeccable quality was absolutely, undeniably real. Valeria confidently approached completely with highly firm, aggressive steps. "What exactly is actively happening completely here, Alejandro? We are incredibly late." She intensely looked directly at Lucia completely, with a highly obvious spark, entirely of highly genuine, toxic jealousy. Well, well, the highly pathetic little housewife has highly successfully gotten herself a highly cheap makeover. Exactly who highly generously paid entirely for it? Did you successfully find absolutely some highly rich, pathetic old sugar daddy? Lucia completely, utterly ignored Valeria. She fiercely kept her piercing eyes violently locked completely onto Alejandro. "I absolutely did not actively come entirely for the pathetic alimony, Alejandro," Lucia stated firmly. "I have actively come directly to highly aggressively work." "Work?" Alejandro let out a highly sharp, incredibly incredulous, highly toxic laugh. "What exactly is highly actively wrong? Are you highly pathetically aspiring completely to the highly low position entirely of a cheap receptionist? We are absolutely not actively hiring, sweetheart. Aggressively go completely back home, directly to actively take complete care entirely of the highly annoying child." Arthur Sterling confidently took exactly one massive step completely forward. Alejandro vividly recognized him instantly. He was the highly legendary, absolute most terrifying corporate lawyer entirely in massive New York. Alejandro's heavy stomach violently plummeted. Why exactly was the highly terrifying Sterling confidently standing perfectly with his highly pathetic ex-wife? "Mr. Reynolds," Arthur stated completely with a highly freezing coldness. "Ms. Vance is absolutely not actively coming entirely to highly pathetically ask entirely for a highly basic job. Ms. Vance officially possesses a highly critical board meeting entirely at exactly 10 a.m. sharp," Lucia highly elegantly corrected. She smoothly turned directly toward the highly exclusive, private executive elevator. Strictly reserved, exclusively, entirely for the absolute highest elite executives and massive board members. A highly massive security guard confidently stepped completely forward immediately. He rapidly scanned a highly elite, exclusive black card that Lucia effortlessly held, and the highly massive golden doors smoothly slid completely open. Alejandro intensely observed completely with his arrogant jaw, miraculously almost completely on the hard floor. "Wait! You absolutely cannot legally go completely up perfectly there. That is officially the highly exclusive executive elevator. Security, violently stop her!" Alejandro violently screamed. The massive security guard intensely looked directly at Alejandro completely, with pure, unadulterated boredom. "Her highly elite credentials are completely, undeniably valid, sir. Please, highly respectfully step completely back." Lucia confidently entered the highly exclusive elevator. She smoothly turned completely around to intensely look directly at Alejandro, just exactly as the heavy golden doors aggressively began to smoothly close, the highly terrified expression completely on his handsome face. A highly complex mixture entirely of blinding fury, massive confusion, and a highly incipient, growing absolute terror was significantly sweeter than absolutely any highly expensive vintage champagne. "I will absolutely see you perfectly entirely in the massive boardroom, Alejandro," she stated incredibly softly. The heavy doors smoothly closed, violently cutting entirely off the highly toxic connection. Part 7. The Reign of the Heiress. In the highly massive, highly secure boardroom entirely on the 40th floor, the absolute highest, most elite floor entirely of the massive Vanguard Tower. The absolute entire, highly powerful board of directors was actively waiting. The incredibly massive mahogany table was heavily surrounded entirely by highly powerful men and highly influential women, flawlessly wearing incredibly dark, highly expensive suits. At the absolute head entirely of the massive table prominently stood a highly imposing, empty chair. The absolute, highly massive throne that had proudly belonged completely to Victor Vanguard, entirely for exactly 4 agonizing decades. The highly massive double doors violently flew completely open, and Lucia Vance confidently entered. The highly heavy silence was absolutely instantaneous and completely sepulchral. These highly elite executives had absolutely heard highly vague rumors entirely about a highly secret heir, but they highly arrogantly expected a highly spoiled, pathetic child. Or absolutely someone highly easily, maliciously manipulated. They absolutely did not aggressively expect this highly terrifying, absolute vision entirely of pure corporate power. Lucia confidently walked completely with highly firm, absolute steps directly to the absolute head entirely of the massive table. She gently left her highly expensive leather briefcase completely on the polished table. She absolutely did not immediately sit completely down. She stood perfectly, entirely behind her loving father's massive chair, proudly reclaiming it completely with her absolute, highly undeniable presence alone. "Good highly morning, gentlemen," Lucia stated, and her beautiful voice was incredibly clear, violently resonating completely with highly unquestionable, absolute authority. "My exact name is officially Lucia Vance. I am officially the absolute, only biological daughter entirely of the late Victor Vanguard, and completely from this highly precise, exact instant. I am officially the absolute brand new president entirely of this massive board." A highly shocked, low murmur violently rippled completely through the massive room. "We officially possess a highly tight, packed agenda completely today," she aggressively continued. "Finally, smoothly sitting heavily down entirely in the highly imposing leather chair. It flawlessly fit her completely perfectly. Our absolute first highly critical point is the massive merger proposal completely with Apex Capital. Safely open the heavy doors entirely to Mr. Reynolds and his highly pathetic team. I highly confidently believe they are incredibly anxious entirely to completely know their absolute, tragic destiny. The heavy doors smoothly opened completely again. Alejandro Reynolds confidently entered absolutely first, heavily flanked entirely by Valeria Thorne and exactly 2 highly nervous analysts. They confidently entered completely with highly smug, toxic smiles, completely with the highly arrogant, elite air entirely of highly arrogant people who genuinely believe that the massive deal is absolutely already completely closed. Alejandro had aggressively spent the absolute last 24 agonizing hours highly mentally aggressively spending his highly massive bonus, a highly expensive, brand new, massive yacht, a highly luxurious, expensive trip directly to the Maldives, and perhaps a highly expensive, massive diamond bracelet entirely for Valeria. Alejandro stood completely, utterly frozen entirely mid-step, at the absolute end, entirely, of the massive 10-meter table, sitting perfectly entirely in the highly coveted president's seat, was officially Lucia. She absolutely wasn't highly submissively serving cheap coffee. She absolutely wasn't highly pathetically taking notes. She was comfortably leaning completely back, entirely, in the highly imposing leather throne, her soft fingers flawlessly interlaced, intensely staring directly at him completely, with piercing eyes exactly as freezing cold, exactly as a highly bitter winter entirely in Madrid. But exactly what the hell is absolutely this? Valeria violently hissed completely under her breath, her highly toxic, smug smile completely, violently disappearing. Why exactly is your highly pathetic ex-wife happily sitting entirely in the massive president's chair? Alejandro physically felt his toxic blood violently boil. This absolutely had to be a highly terrible, highly pathetic bad joke. He arrogantly thought that Lucia had highly pathetically slept completely with absolutely some highly dirty board member simply just entirely to highly pathetically humiliate him. He confidently stepped completely forward, completely with massive rage, violently slamming his massive hands completely on the polished table. Gentlemen, I highly profusely apologize entirely for this highly pathetic intrusion, Alejandro stated, desperately attempting to miraculously regain absolute control. It highly apparently seems that there has absolutely been a highly severe, catastrophic security failure. My highly unstable ex-wife absolutely does not mentally find completely herself perfectly well. She has highly illegally sneaked completely into the highly secure meeting. If you urgently call elite security, we can violently remove her completely and successfully proceed completely with the massive presentation. The massive room remained entirely in a highly deadly, absolute silence. Absolutely no one urgently called elite security. Absolutely no one physically moved a single inch. The highly powerful board members absolutely were not intensely looking directly at Alejandro. They were intensely looking directly at Lucia, anxiously waiting entirely for her highly explosive reaction. Lucia absolutely didn't even violently blink. She simply, highly smoothly, leaned completely forward. And the highly expensive leather entirely of the massive chair softly creaked entirely in the heavy silence. Please, sit completely down, Mr. Reynolds, Lucia stated. Her beautiful voice was completely, utterly, unrecognizable entirely to him. It actively possessed a massive, crushing weight that he had absolutely never, ever clearly heard entirely in the highly dirty kitchen entirely of his massive house. You are officially right here, entirely to flawlessly present the massive Apex merger. We are actively waiting. I am absolutely not actively going to proudly present absolutely anything completely to you. Alejandro violently exploded, completely losing his highly toxic papers. You are absolutely just a highly pathetic housewife, Lucia. You absolutely do not profoundly know the absolute critical difference completely between a massive stock share and a highly pathetic soup spoon. Get the hell out entirely of that massive chair completely before you highly pathetically embarrass yourself even significantly more. Arthur Sterling loudly, aggressively cleared his dry throat. The highly sharp sound was exactly like the violent blow, entirely, of a highly heavy judicial gavel. Mr. Reynolds, Arthur stated completely with a highly cutting, freezing voice. You are actively, highly disrespectfully, addressing the highly absolute majority shareholder and absolute president entirely of the massive board. Entirely of the massive Vanguard Corporation. Miss Lucia Vance legally, absolutely, possesses exactly 51%. Entirely of the highly massive voting shares, entirely of this massive company. If she explicitly tells you to violently sit completely down, you actively sit completely down. If she explicitly tells you to violently jump, you highly politely ask exactly how incredibly high completely before you actively touch the hard floor. Have I been completely, explicitly clear? Alejandro physically felt absolutely all the color completely abandon his handsome face entirely until it was completely, terrifyingly gray. The entire massive world aggressively began to violently spin. He actively had to frantically grab completely onto the heavy chair entirely to absolutely not violently fall. Absolute majority. Massive owner, he whispered, highly horrified. That is completely, medically impossible. She is absolutely poor. I personally, violently threw her completely out entirely of my massive house exactly 1 agonizing month completely ago. You violently threw completely out the absolute biological daughter entirely of Victor Vanguard, Arthur smoothly corrected. A highly catastrophic, massive error entirely of exactly 4 billion euros, Mr. Reynolds. Valeria Thorne let out a highly muffled, terrified gasp. She intensely looked directly at Lucia, then directly at Alejandro. And absolute, pure horror was flawlessly reflected entirely in her piercing eyes, exactly as she frantically made highly rapid mental calculations. She highly physically, cowardly, stepped completely away, entirely, from Alejandro, frantically distancing herself completely from the highly imminent, catastrophic disaster. Lucia beautifully smiled. It was a highly small, incredibly sharp, and utterly terrifying smile. Sit completely down, Alejandro, she smoothly repeated incredibly softly, and actively convince me, successfully convince me entirely of exactly why I absolutely should not violently reduce your highly pathetic, tiny little company completely to absolute ashes right this exact precise moment. Alejandro heavily collapsed completely into the expensive chair. His weak legs were absolutely pure jelly. He frantically looked entirely at his highly detailed notes, but the heavy words were violently dancing completely before his terrified eyes. He desperately attempted to actively speak, but his deep voice was a highly weak, pathetic thread. The massive synergy completely between Apex and Vanguard. "Speak significantly louder, Alejandro," Lucia violently ordered. "I absolutely cannot clearly hear you." Alejandro took a highly massive breath, desperately attempting to miraculously save his highly fragile dignity. But it was an absolute, highly pathetic disaster. He violently stammered, completely forgot the highly critical, massive key points. Lucia generously let him highly pathetically speak entirely for exactly 10 agonizing, highly humiliating minutes. Then she aggressively raised exactly one massive hand. "That is absolutely enough." She smoothly opened the highly thick folder directly in front, entirely of her. "Your highly pathetic proposal actively values the massive technological division entirely of Vanguard, completely at exactly 800 million, but entirely according completely to my highly absolute internal audit that I personally, flawlessly conducted completely last week. Our highly exclusive patents entirely by themselves are absolutely worth exactly 1.2 billion. You are actively, maliciously attempting to highly illegally undervalue us entirely to aggressively secure a highly rapid, pathetic quarterly bonus. The highly complex market valuation," Alejandro pathetically babbled. "Furthermore," Lucia aggressively continued, smoothly turning a crisp page, "Apex Capital is completely, dangerously overleveraged. You are highly illegally actively using massive debt entirely to successfully finance this highly massive acquisition. If this massive deal absolutely does not flawlessly close, Apex will violently enter completely into highly catastrophic default, completely with the massive bank entirely in exactly less than 30 short days." "That absolutely isn't completely true," Valeria shrieked. Valeria violently raised her pale head. "Ms. Vance, You are completely, utterly desperate," Lucia stated, violently closing the heavy folder completely with a highly dry, loud thud. "You confidently came directly here arrogantly, thinking you could successfully rob a highly headless, massive company. You arrogantly thought the highly secret heir absolutely wouldn't miraculously appear, and that you could successfully dismantle Vanguard. But the absolute heiress is officially right perfectly here, and she profoundly knows exactly who you highly toxic people truly are." Lucia confidently stood completely up. The absolute entire massive board confidently stood completely up perfectly, with her completely and absolute unison. "The highly pathetic proposal is completely, permanently rejected," Lucia flawlessly declared. "Vanguard will absolutely never, ever violently merge completely with Apex. What is absolutely significantly more, I have officially given highly strict instructions completely to our highly elite legal team entirely to officially present a highly formal, federal complaint entirely for highly illegal, predatory valuation practices." Alejandro violently jumped completely up, aggressively throwing his heavy chair completely to the hard floor. "Lucia! You absolutely cannot legally do this. If this massive deal violently fails, I completely lose absolutely everything. I violently lose my elite job. I violently lose my massive house." "The massive house?" Lucia gently tilted her beautiful head completely with highly fake, toxic curiosity. "Do you explicitly refer completely to that exact massive house completely from which you violently pushed me, completely out entirely into the freezing rain, exactly where my innocent son possessed absolutely zero roof, completely over his fragile head? I was incredibly, massively stressed," Alejandro pathetically pleaded, completely with thick sweat, aggressively falling completely down his pale face. "Lucia, please, entirely for our highly beautiful past, entirely for Matteo. Do absolutely not fiercely dare to explicitly say his beautiful name. Lucia's beautiful voice violently dropped completely to a highly terrifying whisper that weighed significantly more than a highly loud scream. You completely, violently renounce the absolute right to actively be his true father, exactly when you cruelly told me to highly aggressively take the pathetic crying brat and get the hell completely out. You desperately wanted a highly elite business partner, Alejandro. You desperately wanted absolutely someone who profoundly understood your massive world. She smoothly leaned completely over the massive table, actively being exactly a few highly terrifying centimeters, completely away, entirely from his violently unhinged face. Beautifully welcome completely to my massive world. Get the hell completely out entirely of my massive building. Interactive question. Lucia totally destroyed Alejandro's career and company in front of everyone. Was this the perfect revenge? Tell us below. The end. The Queen ascends. Elite security. Arthur Sterling smoothly signaled completely with a highly firm, absolute gesture. Exactly 2 highly massive security guards entirely, of miraculously almost 2 massive meters, completely in height, aggressively, stepped completely forward, completely, immediately. Alejandro frantically looked completely around, desperately, frantically searching entirely for a highly loyal ally, completely in the massive room, but absolutely only successfully found highly freezing faces entirely of solid stone. He intensely looked directly at Valeria, his absolute last, highly pathetic hope. Valeria, actively say absolutely something. You are absolutely completely with me entirely in this. Valeria intensely looked directly at Lucia, then directly at Alejandro, and her piercing eyes violently became incredibly cold and highly calculating. She cowardly took exactly 1 massive step completely back, aggressively distancing entirely herself, completely from him, exactly as if he were a highly toxic, rotting corpse. I genuinely think you absolutely should rapidly leave, Alejandro, Valeria stated completely with a highly freezing, glacial voice. You have absolutely already actively caused highly sufficient massive damage. Your absolute lack entirely of pure honesty, entirely about your highly toxic personal history, has completely, violently ruined absolutely all, entirely, of us. What? You were completely, 100% in absolute agreement. Alejandro violently screamed exactly as the massive guards aggressively grabbed him completely by his strong arms. I absolutely stand entirely with the absolute winner, Valeria flawlessly sentenced. She smoothly turned directly toward Lucia completely, with a highly forced, fake smile. Ms. Vance, I actively possessed absolutely zero idea entirely of, well, the highly toxic details. I was highly maliciously deceived completely by Mr. Reynolds. I would absolutely love to extensively discuss a highly elite position completely at Vanguard, if you are actively hiring. Lucia let out a highly genuine, massive laugh. A highly loud laugh that beautifully resonated completely throughout the entire massive boardroom. Valeria, you successfully possess massive guts. I will highly generously grant you exactly that. But I absolutely do not actively hire highly toxic traitors. Significantly, much less actively hire highly toxic women who actively help highly toxic men violently throw innocent babies completely out, entirely, into the freezing rain. Security. Aggressively take the highly pathetic Miss Thorne completely away entirely too, while the massive guards aggressively dragged completely out a highly desperately screaming Alejandro and a highly indignantly protesting Valeria. Lucia peacefully sat completely down entirely again. Her massive heart was violently beating incredibly hard, but her soft hands were completely, absolutely firm. She intensely looked directly at the highly powerful members entirely of the massive board, who intensely observed her completely with a highly profound, absolute renewed respect. "Now," Lucia stated, flawlessly smoothing her highly expensive suit, "let's actively discuss the highly aggressive acquisition entirely of the pathetic competition. I highly confidently believe that the massive shares entirely of Apex Capital are actively about to violently plummet completely to absolute zero. I fiercely want to aggressively buy absolutely all of them entirely for highly pathetic pennies." Exactly 6 beautiful months significantly later, the highly exclusive charity gala, entirely at the prestigious Prado Museum, was the absolute, undisputed elite event, entirely of the massive season entirely in Madrid. The highly blinding flashes entirely of the paparazzi cameras flawlessly illuminated the highly exclusive red carpet, exactly as the absolute elite, entirely of the massive city, confidently arrived entirely in their highly expensive limousines. Lucia Vance gracefully stepped completely down entirely from her highly expensive Bentley, flawlessly wearing a highly stunning, emerald green silk designer dress that beautifully highlighted her incredible figure and her highly absolute, brand new massive confidence. She smoothly walked completely down the highly crowded press line, smiling highly elegantly, exactly as the highly aggressive reporters violently shouted highly intrusive questions. "Ms. Vance, is it absolutely true that the massive profits entirely of Vanguard have violently skyrocketed exactly 40%? Lucia, absolutely any highly official comment entirely on the highly catastrophic, absolute total bankruptcy entirely of Apex Capital?" She simply beautifully smiled and confidently kept walking completely forward, inside the massive hall, exactly as she peacefully took a highly elegant sip entirely of expensive champagne. She highly clearly overheard a highly interesting conversation perfectly near the highly exclusive bar, completely between highly ambitious young bankers. "Did you highly actively hear entirely about exactly what violently happened completely to Alejandro Reynolds?" Exactly, one enthusiastically asked. "The highly toxic guy who completely ruined the massive Vanguard deal?" "Yes, absolute, complete, total ruin. Apex highly publicly fired him completely for massive gross negligence. So he successfully received absolutely not exactly one single pathetic euro entirely in massive severance. His highly powerful ex-wife highly aggressively bought the massive company that officially held his massive mortgage and violently evicted him completely exactly last week. Absolutely brutal. And exactly where is he actively now? I highly explicitly heard he brutally works actively selling highly cheap, second-hand used cars, entirely in a highly depressing industrial park, perfectly on the absolute outskirts. Or perhaps highly pathetically driving a cheap Uber. And the highly toxic girlfriend, Valeria, had to highly pathetically return completely to her highly small pathetic village. Absolutely no one, entirely in massive Madrid, actively wants to absolutely even fiercely touch her highly toxic resume. Lucia smoothly turned completely around, profoundly feeling a highly deep, absolute sensation entirely of pure closure. She profoundly felt absolutely zero toxic joy entirely for Alejandro's massive pain. She simply profoundly felt that absolute justice had been completely, flawlessly served. She absolutely no longer desperately needed to violently twist the highly sharp knife. She confidently stepped completely out directly onto the highly beautiful balcony that perfectly overlooked the massive gardens. The freezing night wind was incredibly cold, but she absolutely did not violently shiver. Her expensive phone violently vibrated. It was a highly adorable photo, beautifully sent completely by the elite nanny. Little Matteo, exactly 6 beautiful months old, smiling radiantly and happily, hugging a highly soft teddy bear, securely tucked completely into his highly expensive, warm crib. The highly sweet message explicitly read, "Today, he successfully said mama entirely for the absolute first time." Lucia smiled radiantly, and hot tears beautifully blurred her piercing eyes. She absolutely wasn't entirely just a highly powerful, untouchable multi-billionaire. She was a highly fierce, loving mother who had miraculously, flawlessly protected her innocent son. She had highly aggressively built a highly impenetrable, massive fortress completely around him that absolutely no one would absolutely ever violently tear completely down entirely again. She intensely looked directly at the bright, beautiful lights entirely of massive Madrid. Entirely somewhere, completely in that massive city. Alejandro Reynolds was highly likely actively watching the highly depressing news, vividly seeing her highly powerful, beautiful face perfectly on the glowing screen, and highly agonizingly lamenting the highly exact, precise second, exactly when he highly toxically decided to violently close that highly heavy, solid oak door, but entirely to Lucia Vance. It absolutely did not fiercely matter a single microscopic bit completely anymore. She smoothly turned her highly elegant back completely to the darkness, and confidently returned directly to the bright light entirely of the massive hall, completely ready, entirely, for her highly absolute, beautiful next chapter. The highly pathetic victim had completely, permanently disappeared. The absolute queen had fiercely risen, and exactly this was absolutely only the highly terrifying, beautiful beginning. The philosophical conclusion. This is the highly explosive, massive story entirely of exactly how one highly cruel, toxic decision catastrophically cost a highly arrogant man exactly 4 billion euros. It is a highly profound, absolute reminder that you absolutely should never, ever highly toxically judge absolutely anyone entirely in their highly absolute lowest, most pathetic moment. Because you absolutely never, ever profoundly know exactly when the highly massive tables are actively going to completely, violently turn. Alejandro highly arrogantly thought he was violently throwing completely out a highly pathetic hindrance. But entirely in absolute reality, he was violently throwing completely out his absolute own massive future. Lucia flawlessly, beautifully demonstrated that the absolute best, most highly ultimate revenge absolutely isn't violently screaming or highly aggressively fighting. It is absolute, massive success. A highly massive, completely undeniable, absolute success. What an absolute masterpiece of revenge. Do you guys fiercely think Alejandro and Valeria got exactly the karma they deserved? Would you have shown them any mercy? Or would you have crushed them just like Lucia did? Drop your fierce thoughts in the comments below. Please don't forget to smash that like button, share this incredible story of justice, and subscribe to our channel and hit the bell for more explosive, satisfying stories. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.